Good afternoon. Greetings from a very warm Belgrade. Summer has finally come to various places around the world, maybe too much. Welcome to the June Internet Governance Briefing. For all of you that are newcomers, I'll just briefly outline what the briefing will look like, what we will cover. We usually start with a couple of trends, the hottest digital developments, if you wish, around the world. We dive a little bit into details of what that means, what that brings. Then we go into various other important developments in the digital realm. We look at what's coming when it comes to important events in the next months, in this case over the summer. There will be still some interesting events to follow. And at the end, we certainly look at what Diplo and the Geneva Internet Platform will be offering to all of you in the next month or two. And at the end, we will listen about what are the digital developments in different regions around the world. And usually these regional developments are quite interesting. So stay tuned. And we'll start with, as always, with the trends of the month. Now, usually we cover 3 trends. Those of you that are frequent with us, you know how we work. This time we decided to focus only on one trend, and you'll see why. The trend is called Cyber Hits High Politics. There was a number of high-level meetings, many of them certainly motivated by the visit of the new US president to Europe, NATO, meeting with President Putin and all of that. And apparently, cyber was really high on the agenda. A number of key issues were actually covered in these couple of summits and meetings. So I'll firstly start with bringing in my colleague Stephanie Borg-Psaila from Malta. Stephanie has been working and covering a lot these various developments and what actually happened in these meetings. So Stephanie, I'll pass the floor to you to drive us through the summits and what were the main issues on the agenda, what was touched upon, what it means. We'll come back and talk with details. Stephanie.
Thanks, Vlad. Hi, everyone. It's also warm in Malta. I think it's really everywhere. Okay, so we had these 4 summits in literally the space of 6-7 days. So it was a very hectic time. And Vlad, as you said, cyber was really part of the high politics. So let us see why. 4 summits in which the US President Biden attended them all. Perhaps that is why these attracted so much interest, not perhaps, I'm actually quite sure. And in particular, one of them, the meeting that the president had with Russian President Vladimir Putin, attracted the most interest. And I can also confirm this because of the numbers that we saw from the trends, from the Google Trends, which is the console that Google has, which tracks the search pattern. So what people search for on the search engine. So 4 summits, starting from the G7 summit, NATO, EU, US, and finally ending in Geneva. And if I had to categorize the topics discussed in these 4 summits, in my mind, I would see 2 broad categories. So rather than going through the summit one by one, I'm taking a different approach. I'm looking at them this time from the point of view of the issues, of the topics that were discussed. So 2, let's say, broad categories, and you'll see why I'm grouping them in 2. The first is, I would categorize in the first basket, the frontier technologies, the issues related to e-commerce, to taxation, to data, chips. So it's technology / digital economy topics. The second basket would be topics related to cybercrime, cybersecurity, cyber warfare. I'll cover the first because, Vlad, I know that with your expertise, you'll cover the cyber security part. The first basket, the updates there. the G7 summit, the leaders there, they expressed support for the policy priorities that before them, the digital and technology ministers had already agreed upon. So nothing really new, but a political nod in favor of these 6 focus areas, and those include the ICT supply chain resilience, free flow of data, and standard settings. They also supported, so they also endorsed the commitment that the G7 finance ministers made regarding the digital tax. So the agreement was actually at ministerial level, it was made in early June, and what the G7 leaders in mid-June did was they endorsed that. So nothing new as such, but a strong political nod in favor of what the work that the ministers did a few weeks or months prior to the G7 summit. Still on these same lines, these same topics, at the EU-US summit, which is the summit where President Biden met with the head of the European Commission, von der Leyen, and the head of the European Parliament, Charles Michel, and they announced the formation of the new Trade and Tech Council. Now, the details on how this will work are still sketchy. Because, and here I'm quoting what the commissioner's trade chief told reporters right after the meeting. So he said today's decision is basically about establishing a council, and we have already agreed to ask our teams to start preparing the practical implementation and shaping it as a trade and technology council. So him saying that is practically saying that they're still ironing out the details on how the council will work, but at least it's formed. What we do know is that the work will be carried out in 10 working groups. So again, a repetition of, let's say, those topics that were mentioned at the G Summit, and we're seeing the tech standards, chips, and data flows. So again, a nod, perhaps more than a nod in this meeting, and we'll have to see how the 10 working groups will become operational in the days and the weeks to come. So to me, in my mind, that summarizes, let's say, the topics on e-commerce, on data, on chips, on taxation. The second category, I think, is a little bit more interesting because of the meeting, well, the NATO summit, but more interestingly, the Biden and Putin summit. So at this stage, Vlada, I'll give the floor back to you for an overview of what happened in these 2 other summits.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, my impression is that there was quite a palette of issues. It was not just security, obviously, but there seems to be no major breakthrough, no, as you mentioned, no new topics on the agenda. But at this point, stay with us, Stephanie. We'll come back soon to you, but I want to bring in Jovan now, because one thing that is important in all these discussions and processes is actually the process itself, so not necessarily the topic. So I'm bringing in Jovan Kurbalia. Well, I don't know, Jovan, whether you're in Geneva or in Malta or wherever around the world. Welcome again. And looking at these four major summits, and Stephanie has went through the main bits of that. My question is, if there is nothing really new on the agenda, should we say that something actually moved? And what might be the key takeaways and the key impacts of these 4 summits? Jovan.
Thank you, Vlada. Yes, I'm connecting from Malta, not very, from very warm Malta. And there are a few points which came resonating after these 4 summits. One is reconfirming build-up for the Biden presidency. If you can recall, in November, December, there were many papers basically shaping the way for digital policy of Biden presidency. And one of the elements was focus on values and deal somehow with mainly China on the economic issues, digital economy, and Russia on cybersecurity. I'm now simplifying the overall build-up. Now, this was the first event after internal events at the Congress and the overall internal build-up within the United States. It was the first international series of events that outlined clearly US approach, and obviously US being the leading digital power, something that will shape the global digital politics. And Steph mentioned a few points. I would say the underlying message is let us close the ranks around the digital Euro-Atlantic cooperation between US and Europe with tech and trade cooperation. Let's close the ranks with between Europe and US, including some sort of concessions which US made on the question of taxation, which we'll discuss later on. US moved quite close to Europe when it comes to European Union concern about digital taxation. That was the first point, closing the ranks between EU and US. The second point is finding the common strategy towards China and Russia. And here are 2 points. Much more complex exercise with China because of the economic interdependence, because of supply chains. And one unanswered question is, to what extent the powers will allow potential disintegration of the internet? And the bottom line is, I would say, keeping active supply chains. While in the other fields, we may expect some sort of surprises. And towards Russia, therefore towards China was more economic interdependence with some sort of add-on of the spices on cybersecurity. But with Russia, the main issue was the question of cybersecurity. Therefore, this is the sort of zoom out view. And what was interesting, especially during G7 summit, Western powers basically tried to offer another carrot which should be competing with the Belt and Road Initiative, digital aspects of Belt and Road Initiative. That would be sort of a summary. Closing the ranks of digital Euro-Atlantic cooperation, dealing with economic dependence, digital economic dependence with China, and discussing supply chains, which is very tricky issue, especially for, let's say, German export-oriented economy, but generally Western economies with a lot of activities in Asia. Dealing with the cybersecurity issues with Russia. I would say that would be more or less mapping of the main developments, and also hinting that United States and Western allies will use multilateral channels in order to promote their interests. Therefore, close cooperation among themselves, but also using multilateral channels such as UN, G20, OECD, and other bodies to promote their interests. Over to you, Vlada.
Thank you, Jovan. So before I move also to Marco, Marco is moderating the chat, so I encourage you to share your thoughts, share your reflections, certainly add any questions that you might want. So I'll come back soon to Marco to just summarize if there is anything interesting coming from the chat. But I want to briefly come back to Jovan again with a short question. Looking at these summits, and I think you underlined clearly the importance of the Euro-Atlantic connection, right? But probably one of the, and Stephanie mentioned it at the beginning, one of the hottest parts of this tour was actually Biden-Putin meeting. And Diplo and the GIP had extensive coverage of that, number of interviews and post-event and so on. We started the discussion with the question, is this meeting going to be a sort of a cyber detente? Will finally the pressure be a little bit released between the US and Russia? And I want to come back to you with that question. Do you have the impression that we are moving to the era where this US-Russian relations, when it comes to cyber at least, will be maybe better? And what, can we be optimists in a way? Jovan.
Well, I hope so. And I think there are a few points, regardless of just flipping the coin and working with the intuition. All the intuition matters in life. But there are some building blocks. Obviously, US and China, US and Russia are looking for some sort of easing of tensions. And there are a few areas where they can ease the tension relatively easily. Let's say not necessarily low-hanging fruit, but something which they can do. One is strategic cooperation around the nuclear weapons, and it was clear that that they will start at least talking or engaging. And second area is cyber field, and here we have more nuanced development. One is a difference between two countries when it comes to the core cybersecurity or interstate security relations in digital field. And second one, more agreement on the question of cybercrime. Therefore, I'm optimistic in a sense that there will be signals mainly coming from Russia, but not only Russia, also from the US, on cooperation on cybercrime. And it's not surprising since, as we know, that Russia is quite active in the third committee proposing cybercrime convention. Therefore, we can expect easing of tension around the cooperation around the issues like it was attack, ransomware attack on the colonial pipeline and a few recent ransomware attacks. I expect a gradual buildup of trust and cooperation from, let's say, cybercrime field, and then we will see if there will be any spillover into the core cybersecurity. We shouldn't forget that Russia and the United States endorse both open-ended working group report and UNGG report. Therefore, there is more cooperation than it is reported in the media, which usually focuses on incidents and tensions, which is more media-friendly coverage. Therefore, I'm optimistic. Over to you.
Thank you. And I remember we had some interviews with different guests which were moderate optimists, but it seems like in the follow-up, and we hope to see more, that we can be more and more optimistic. I promised to get back to Marco at this point. So Marco, any interesting bits from the chat?
Yes, thank you, Vlada. There are quite a few interesting comments, but I'll start with the first one that Sorina pointed out. She wanted to draw the attention on something that is not strictly digital, but still it's related to it, and we should keep on our watch. She's saying that while there might have been nothing really new on the agenda, there was one very specific point that I found interesting in the EU-US summit statement in relation to standardization, and I'm quoting now. We intend to explore the possibility of developing a new research initiative on biotechnology and genomics with view to setting common standards. So Sorina is saying biotech is not an area we usually pay attention to in the context of digital policy, but this could be a sign that we might want to look more closely into it. And Stephanie is definitely agreeing with Sorina, saying that it's certainly a topic that we should watch more closely. And her opinion is that the EU wants to get into the game more visibly since Australia, India, Japan, and the USA also agreed to create a working group to cooperate on biotech, among other things. But I told you that there were also other issues and comments. And the second one is by Nigel. He's pointing out that he thinks that G7 messages were quite important, not least noting governments' commitments to involve themselves in standards developments and also internet and AI. So he's making the link between the G7 summit and the Biden-Putin summit. And that is all for the moment from the chat.
Thank you, Marco, for these comments, and I encourage all of you to jump in with more comments, as this is the only trend for this month. We have some more time to explore in details. There are a couple of things that were mentioned. I'll briefly reflect on security aspects that were mentioned a couple of times, and I'll get back to again Stephanie and Jovan with more reflections on specific topics. But one topic is security, which was definitely going through all these summits, and probably the most discussed was at the Biden-Putin summit, where, as Jovan mentioned, on one hand, the US was quite clear on what are the red lines when it comes to protecting the critical infrastructure in the US, and these 16 critical infrastructure elements that are observed as critical in the US. That's the red line. On the other hand, it was a constructive possible next step on cooperation against cybercrime. There was a lot of discussion whether we would see both parties moving on with the promises. Currently, we have seen the Russian security services and security apparatus, which came up afterwards, confirming that they would be going after certain criminal groups, but also expecting from the US to, if nothing, secure the digital environment, as many attacks are actually originating, or command and control servers are originating from the US. So we'll see what happens on that front. When it comes to NATO, there was an interesting discussion, or well, sort of reiteration, that the Article 5, which allows NATO to actually respond to an attack, applies to cyber, and it was quite clear that they do intend to use all the means that they might have, so not just the cyber means, in response to a possible cyber attack. Certainly, there was sort of a clarification that there would be only according to international law, and when the case would be of the armed attack. Now, what the armed attack actually means, there was certainly, it's still quite unclear. There are a lot of discussions following the GG open-ended working group. But one thing was clear, that in NATO, that would be decided on case by case, and that what would be taken into consideration, and that's quite interesting and maybe new, is that the cumulative impact of attacks could be taken into consideration. So it might not be only one single attack that is judged, but also a cumulative impact of cyber attacks that might be taken into account. Now that's when it comes to security, but I want to come back to Stephanie now with a bit more on, and you mentioned, Stephanie, the supply chain. I think it's supply chain standards, two topics which are quite interesting. On supply chain, I'm sure one aspect is not just China, but generally making sure that this whole supply chain is reliable and secure. On standards, there was a lot of discussion on particularly security, but also these new standards and maybe politicization of standards and development of standards. I wonder what are the key lines on these two topics, Stephanie?
Thanks, Vlada. Well, with regards to standardization, the politics behind it is the following. It's not explicit, but what the leaders have been alluding to is the development of the new IP put forward by Chinese companies. So that's what is happening at the background. Regarding semiconductors, we know that there's a global shortage, and I think although both let's say the two giants, the US and China, want to be as self-sufficient as possible, there's another player also in the sector, and that's the Taiwan Corporation, where a report last week said that over 90% of the production of chips is coming from this company. So I think there's a little bit of fear from both these countries, and Taiwan a little bit stuck in the middle. So where to, you know, on which, let's say, left or right, where to go more closely to. But at the end, it's a big problem because the consumers are feeling it. The vehicle industry is impacted. Consumer electronics are impacted. So it's let's say it's a fear, and it's justified. So this is all happening in the background, and is the reason why we continue to see these topics coming up and up again.
Thanks, Steph. I'll briefly comment on that one on supply chain. Then I want to get back to Jovan with these new technologies and chips and all that. But one of the main challenges when it comes to the supply of the chips and the silicon is actually this high-tech level. So 5 nanometers technology, which is the cutting edge. And that is something that really, apart from Taiwan semiconductor industry and Samsung at this point, and possibly Intel in some near future again, are not catching up. Now, there is an interesting discussion about how Europe could position itself and build up on chip industry that it has on the European ground, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in other places, but it still can't catch this cutting edge technology, and there is a lot of investment which is needed, probably a strategic decision on how to deal with that. Now, I'm coming back to Jovan with the question on new technologies, emerging technologies, whatever is coming from quantum to biocomputer to biotechnology to chips. We see that the US has in recent months pushed a little bit investment and strategic approach towards new technologies. How do you see this interplay, well, also in context of these meetings, US, Europe, NATO, Russia, and then China, when it comes to new technologies and what we can expect in the next 10 years? Jovan.
Vlada, this is a crucial issue, and it started being reported more and more. What has happened during even previous Trump administration, it moves with the sanctions deeper and deeper into supply chains. And it came to the part of technology, which is a so-called water fab. And in Europe, we have some production on microchips, including in Malta, there is SGS Thompson factory, one of the oldest microchips factory, but producing microchips from the older generation. The problem is that so-called in this terminology, Europe is fabless. It doesn't have this water fab, which are basically the key for the development of technology. Most of this technology moved towards Asia, and you have it now in Taiwan, most of it, some companies in the United States and some in China. And some producers in this supply chain, like a few Dutch companies, which are essential for this development, which shows on one side huge interlinkages, A, B, time which is needed for research and development, and C, huge geostrategical dependence. We have, in addition to the problem with the COVID, there was a problem of increased pressure due to the Bitcoin mining, due to the AI on these powerful processors. Therefore, this is going to be huge geostrategic battle, and some people are even discussing the question of Taiwan as a producer of most of the latest microprocessors, and obviously tension around Taiwan, especially between China and the United States. Therefore, that is going to be a major development to follow, and I guess on the geoeconomics, not necessarily geopolitics, Europe will try to get back some of the production of these water fabs, which are the basis of the microprocessors, back to Europe, and to become more self-sufficient in developing this latest generation of the processors.
Thank you, Jovan. And in this regards, probably this closer cooperation of the US and Europe, Euro-Atlantic cooperation might be a boost. I'm going back to Marco to check whether there are any interesting comments from the chat. Marco.
There are actually, Vlada, there are quite a few. A couple of questions on cybercrime and a couple of comments. When it comes to cybercrime, Anuba is asking, is the US meeting with Putin a realization that technology superiority cannot protect the US from Russian cyber attacks, and therefore a holistic bilateral political process will go a long way? It is asked in a form of a question, but I think it entails already an answer, but I will let you and the other panelists answer that. And another question from Deborah. Can you talk more about the third committee work and what countries are most interested in pushing for a cybercrime convention, and those countries that are least interested in? And then we have a comment from Richard saying that I think that the cryptic references to what China is doing were more likely references to the US Clean Network Initiative. This is an initiative that is the drive to exclude certain Chinese and hardware and software companies rather than references to the so-called new IP. But he adds, it stands to be corrected. And then a last question again from Deborah. How will the new draft of the US National Institute of Standards and Technology supply chain standard play out internationally? This is all again from the chat discussion. Vlada, back to you.
Thank you, Marco. I'll try to briefly reflect on the cybercrime discussions. I can spend 2 more minutes with Jovan and Steph. They have further comments on the questions. When it comes to discussion of cybercrime and cybersecurity, or if you wish, international peace and stability, when it comes to cyber, have always been separate processes, and the West insists that should be separated, while Russia, China, and the others are trying to somehow also bring them together, even though they are discussed in different committees. Now, while the open-ended working group and the group of governmental experts in the first committee discuss and mention cybercrime, but do not get into that, they certainly acknowledge the need not to duplicate the efforts. The third committee has started the ad hoc expert group, which is discussing the possible draft convention on cybercrime. That has been pushed for quite some years by Russia and its partners, with the idea to have a global convention, while the West at the same time considers that the Budapest Convention of the Council of Europe, even though it is a regional organization, mechanism, instrument, is actually de facto a global mechanism, working global instrument, also ratified by a number of countries which are not members of the Council of Europe. There is a lot beyond just provisions about cybercrime, comparing the draft that the Russians have been submitting in the previous years and the Budapest Convention, which is now under review, sort of, and the additional protocol. In essence, in practicality, there is not much of difference, but there is a lot of questions about sovereignty and where other countries could be going when it comes to collecting the data, the evidences. And there is certainly also a political element of that, a geopolitical element of that, of positioning and being able to maybe control also the content, which can be part of crime and so on. I'll leave it certainly to the comments of others, but I want to maybe briefly come back to Stephanie for any sort of comments. Stephanie, if you have, and then I'll conclude with Jovan's remarks. Stephanie.
Thank you, Vlada. Regarding standards, I think it's, and I'm replying to a comment by Richard. What the G7 leaders agreed on now is more of a confirmation of what the digital ministers agreed on back a few months ago. And one of them, so one of those six key areas is the digital technical standards. And if we look at the framework that the digital ministers agreed on, and here I'm quoting from the framework. So they're saying we have committed to stronger international cooperation within the G7 and with like-minded partners to support inclusive multi-stakeholder approaches in line with our core values. The wording there is what leads us to believe that when it comes to the standards, all of this is alluding to China's new IP, because when the discussion started about the new IP, the wording that was used there is quite similar to what we're seeing now. And so it's almost logical to do a 1 + 1 and say, this is still relating to that issue. I'll copy paste the relevant parts in the chat, and happy to discuss further. Thank you, Vlada, back to you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks for joining the chat discussions. I think this is always precious to have this parallel discussion in chat here and there. And I'm briefly coming back to Jovan with any final comments to wrap up this part of the briefing on the main trend. So Jovan, any reflections from your side?
Well, at one point, a comment from Anubha Gupta about a sort of a political, are Russia and the US realizing that these tensions around cybersecurity could damage them. Well, one point is that I think they're realizing, but they have obviously different positions, but they are inclined to cooperate. But there are many countries beyond the US, Russia and US, and this is a real question. How to engage them, how to involve India, how to involve China, how to involve European Union. And this is going to be a huge issue. I don't think that it could be just bilateral detente, like with nuclear weapons during the Cold War. It must be multilateral multilateral detente. This is important aspect. And Deborah, you mentioned on the third committee and the overall question of cybercrime. For me, it is an interesting issue where potentials for global cooperations are not exploited. There are some concerns of the countries that they are not ready to adhere to the Budapest Convention because ranging from substantive, like Russia, they have concern with a certain article, to very symbolic, that it is European regional convention. And but the fact is that Budapest Convention influenced the way how cybercrime is regulated worldwide on the regional and national level. It introduced terminology, new concepts. And it is a pity that we cannot find a bridge between Budapest Convention and the global dynamics. And my hope is that these dynamics in the third committee can create more bridges and introduce somehow inbuilt Budapest Convention in whatever will be coming on global level. One good signal is that if you read carefully a resolution which is tabled by Russia, and if you follow to their initial resolution, it is quite watered down, and you have quite a few points which came from the position of the United States. Therefore, yes, Russia pushed for that resolution in General Assembly, but it seems that diplomatically they were careful not to go too far with their proposal, but to include position in particular of the United States and to some extent European Union. Therefore, in this field, I see a lot of possibilities for the global cooperation. There should be political will because everybody is somehow endangered by the cybercrime. And there are possibility to use existing instruments like Palermo Convention on fighting the organized crime. Most of digital crime is somehow organized, involving more than 2 persons. Therefore, with a bit of political will, a bit of luck, and I would say political wisdom, we can expect more cooperation in this field, in spite of this double track again with the Budapest Convention and the Russian UN Cybercrime Convention.
Thank you, Jovan. And one of the takeaways certainly is that it seems that the countries, including the big ones, are understanding the high stakes of security and stability and crime and all of that. So, and again, another good signal is that there is more and more interest from developing countries to actually get involved into discussions about cybersecurity in the first committee, in the third committee. So indeed, this can be a sort of a important process of putting together and discussing, regardless of when we can actually expect some results. With this, we close the part on trends and we move on to the barometer. Now, to explain that a little bit is the trends is something that we try to summarize what was really standing out in the month. But we try to measure the pressure of different topics when it comes to cybersecurity or digital topics, and not only cybersecurity, and see what is the high pressure. And you can see the digital barometer behind me, where we signaled where the high pressure this month was. And I'll explain a little bit some of those other developments which are relevant. Starting with the global IG architecture, we covered it mainly with these summits that we had with the trend. Looking at e-commerce and economy, there was an introduction of the 6-bill antitrust legislative package in the US House of Representatives, and that's a signal that we are seeing another strong push to tackle somehow the market power of the big tech industries. At the same time, we see some new investigations launched against the big tech market practices and monopoly. And in terms of content policy, it's worth certainly mentioning the Facebook's decision to ban the account of former President Trump for 2 years, which comes after the Facebook's oversight board actually asked the company to review the decision and specifically the duration of the bans. And now moving to security, I'll invite my colleague Andreana to join me as well, because Andreana has been following quite closely, welcome, has been following quite closely the work of some of those we mentioned. The group of governmental experts has issued a report. The open-ended working group is continuing the work. What's actually happening?
Hello everyone, nice to be here. Nice to be here so early in the briefing. When it comes to the GG, they adopted a consensus report end of May. A few days after that, we got the advanced copy. And the report, I think it's the most important thing that I say this first. It refers to the previous GG reports of 2010, 2013, 2015, and it refers to the OEWG report from March, which we explained in detail in our March briefing. So there's continuity there, and it was a concern that the processes will split, but they are, since they were in parallel, but we can see there's complementarity there, which was very, very often mentioned in the 2 years that the processes ran. When it comes to the content of the report itself, it deals with threats, and it underlines that the threats that were there are still persistent. When it comes to international law, what is new is that they have explicitly said that international humanitarian law only applies to times of war and not times of peace. This was something that was not addressed ever before. The most important, interesting part of the report is probably the elaboration of the norms. The norms that were first outlined in the 2015 report, the famous 13 voluntary norms, have now been elaborated with more steps on how to actually implement them. And I would now switch to the OEWG, because I could talk about the GG report for days. For those of you that are interested in more details, my colleague Marco will drop a link in the chat. There is a written analysis. I think it's around 4 pages. So I'll switch to the OEWG now, better that I do it. The OEWG had its organizational session at the beginning of June. And instead of meeting for 2 days, they met for only 1. What is the most important thing is what they actually came to discuss, and that will be how they will organize their work. They decided on consensus, and there was a proposal that not everything should be by consensus. That in practice means that some country could decide not to support the inclusion of a topic on the agenda. Basically, that topic would never have the chance to make it into the final report. However, the chair cut that down very, very quickly, very fast into the session, and they have decided that all their work will be consensus-based, not only the decision-making and the adoption of the report. What was also hotly discussed were the topic of subgroups. The OEWG does have this mandate to organize subgroups that will be thematic. There isn't still agreement on how many subgroups there will be. What was underlined is that the subgroups cannot be run in parallel because there are delegations that don't have that many experts or that many members. Also discussed was that topics cannot be hierarchical, and so the subgroups cannot either, because all topics are equally important, because they are all equally interconnected. On multi-stakeholder engagement, the most contested thing is how to involve stakeholders. Should they be involved as they were in the previous OEWG? That's an informal session for the stakeholders only. Or should they be included in the formal substantive sessions? Or should they be included in the subgroups? In the end, there were a lot of open questions, and the chair has stated they will discuss them in informal settings between now and November, when the first substantive session will be held. This is a government-dominated process, and we are not sure if these informal discussions will be open to the public, but at the very least, we'll be able to see the follow-up in November. For those of you that are interested in which country said what, there is a report on Digital Watch Observatory. My colleague will drop the link in the chat. And there is also another analysis of the organizational session where we go into the details of the discussions and what were the things they couldn't agree on and what were the open questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, the coverage is very, very detailed also on the website. What is encouraging to see also in context of the meetings that we had, and Biden Putin particularly, was that we actually managed to see within a couple of weeks' time the global consensus in a way on a report of all the states, and then of the big ones, and the GG would really step ahead. That the new process, which will now last for 5 years, the Open Energy Working Group, has also a chair, Singapore, which showed to be in the previous process quite inclusive, quite open to involve other stakeholders. So we can probably hope that it will remain an open, really inclusive process. So watch for the Open Energy Working Group in New York, online, wherever it happens in the next period, and we'll certainly be covering more. You can stay with me for a few more minutes.
It will be my pleasure.
I'll just briefly mention the two other hot issues on the barometer. One is on jurisdiction, where the Court of Justice of the EU confirmed that the online platforms are exempt from liability when it comes to content that infringes copyright rules, as long as these platforms are not actually contributing to making it available. And the other high pressure area is the new technologies. We've mentioned already a little bit of that, frontier technologies in these multilateral processes. But besides that, we have seen that when it comes to artificial intelligence, the EU data protection bodies called for a ban on the use of AI for automated recognition of human features in public spaces. Something we have been discussing in the previous months when it comes to trends and developments. And we are now moving on to the next part of this briefing, which is the events next month. And that's where I move away and I leave Andriana to lead you through to the next part of the briefing. Andriana.
Thank you, Vlada. So you can very well see the upcoming events behind me. This time we listed a bit more than we usually do. In the interest of time, I will not be reading them out, but I will be mentioning the event that's actually happening right now, and that's EuroDIG, the European Regional Initiative on Internet Governance. In case you missed to register, there's still time. The first day is half over, but the second day is tomorrow. And in case you cannot attend at all, don't worry, the GIP has you covered. We are once again the official reporting partner of EuroDIG, and our reporters are right now in sessions writing messages, and they will write reports from all the workshops that are occurring. There are 17 over the course of 2 days, so be on the lookout for that on our Digital Watch Observatory. Also, let us know if there are events in your calendar that you are attending and that are perhaps not on this list. Use hashtag events and put your event in the chat. And don't close your calendars yet, because we are now moving to Geneva, where my colleague Marco will tell us which events Diplo has planned, and he will also lead us through some of our other activities, such as courses and newsletters. Marco, over to you.
Thank you, Andriana. Let me briefly summarize, as you anticipate, what to expect from us in the upcoming weeks. First of all, we will have next week, on the 6th of July, our web debate, Emojis and Diplomacy, Best Practices and Lesson Learned. This is our monthly appointment when it comes to web debates, which we usually hold every first Tuesday of every month. And then we'll jump straight to August. On the 26th of August, we will have Diplomacy and Technology, an Historical Journey. And then towards the end, again, of August, our Artificial Intelligence and Internet of Things tours. This is part of the 12 Tours to Navigate Digital Geneva. For those of you that do not know this project that we are running, it's our attempt to link all the different incubators of digital expertise in Geneva and make sure that we are able to have an overall and a zoom out view of whatever is going on in Geneva, in each organization and among these organizations when it comes to digital. So it's important for the Geneva scene because we mainly focus on the Geneva organizations, but it's also of interest for a wider public, because as we found in our study, more than 50% of digital policy issues that are discussed worldwide happen in Geneva. Most of the discussions happen in Geneva. So the impact is relevant also for an audience that is outside Geneva. And then of course, our usual monthly appointment, our monthly briefing on internet governance, covering this time July, during which we will pause, and August at the same time. But let's now go to the second slide, covering our courses. So on the mid-July, the upcoming month, in particular 26th, we will have the start of Diplo summer courses, in particular 21st century diplomacy, diplomatic law, privileges and immunities, internet technology and policy, in particular challenges and solutions, and our multilateral diplomacy course. It's important for those of you that are still interested in applying to our courses, the 9th of August, it's the application deadline for a few of the courses that will start in the autumn. So if you're interested in economic diplomacy, language and diplomacy, and also cybersecurity, which we discussed a lot today, you may want to keep this deadline into consideration, and you still have time to apply. Just to conclude briefly this small section on what to expect from us, let me jump on the third slide on resources. Our newsletters, as you know, monthly, at the beginning of each month, we publish the GAP Digital Watch monthly newsletter. We cover, as we do also during our briefings, the main digital policy developments that have happened during the previous months. But for those of you that are particularly keen to stay on top of digital policy developments as they happen, we also have our weekly newsletter, the GAP Digital Watch Weekly Digest, that we will publish every Friday. So stay tuned for both of these resources and for our upcoming events. Andriana, I give you back the floor.
Thank you, Marco, for that overview. Dear friends, don't unbuckle your seatbelts yet, because we are now flying to Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the first stop on our world tour that is traditional at the end of every briefing. Pedro is waiting for us in Brazil, and Pedro will be telling us more about the region's adoption of 5G technologies. Pedro, over to you.
This month, in the Latin American and Caribbean region, we have seen the return of a trend regarding 5G and connectivity. Countries have been taking several steps to ensure the proper ground is set for the widespread adoption of the technology. In Brazil, for example, the Ministry of Communications has announced that the auctions for the 5G concessions will be taking place in the second half of 2021. Through the auctions, companies will be able to explore different bandwidth frequencies in order to offer connectivity services to the populations. But they will also be required to make certain commitments in return, such as ensuring there is 4G infrastructure for every community with more than 600 inhabitants. Meanwhile, in Uruguay, the telecommunications giant Claro has obtained the approval of the country's telecom regulator to make technical tests with the 28 GHz 5G frequency. Costa Rica, however, plans to discard the 6 GHz frequency by 2025. Countries across the world have used the 6 GHz frequency for 5G in different ways, with China, for example, making full use of the spectrum, while European countries tend to divide the 6 GHz frequency between 5G and Wi-Fi applications. While most governments in Latin America have made a commitment to expand the coverage and infrastructure for 5G in the region, it still lags significantly behind other countries, especially developed countries, but also behind some developing countries in Asia, for example. This reflects the country's usual delay in the adoption of emerging technologies.
Thank you, Pedro. The journey continues, and now we will hear about the woes of social media companies regarding their content moderation policy. In particular, we'll hear about Twitter and Facebook. Let's first go to India, where we'll hear from Amrita about Twitter's tension with the Indian government. Over to you, Amrita.
Hello Welcome to the regional update from Asia for the month of June. This month, I will be highlighting the tensions between Twitter and the Indian government. The Indian government is locking horns with Twitter over its non-compliance to the Information Technology Rules 2021, thereby raising concerns if the company would lose its intermediary status and the safe harbor protection it presently enjoys on user-generated content. The new IT rules came into effect last month, and as part of the compliance, the significant social media intermediaries have to appoint a local compliance officer, nodal contact person, set up grievance response mechanism, take down content within 36 hours of a legal order. While Twitter has requested for 3 months extension for compliance, the government has issued one last notice to the company. It may be mentioned that Twitter has been embroiled with the government over its content moderation policy. The government alleges Twitter's content policy is prejudged and prejudiced, and the company is defying India and its laws by non-compliance. On the other hand, Twitter has expressed concerns over potential threat of freedom of expression in India. The company further stated that it has complied to most of the takedown notices from the Indian government. Recently, Twitter officials have been summoned by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on IT, and in another case, the police summoned Twitter's top officials to respond over the allegations that the company failed to stop the spread of videos inciting hate and enmity. While the government has stated that non-compliance to the IT rules will lead to loss of Twitter's intermediary status, however, there are counter-arguments that it will be ultimately decided by the courts. Will Twitter want to lose its intermediary status in its third largest market? Will the government or politicians want to lose a platform which they actively use for their propaganda? Both possibilities seem unlikely. We can expect to witness more development and negotiations to hopefully de-escalate this tension. And that's all from me for this month. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita. I'm sure you'll keep us informed about these developments in the coming months. And now we go to Africa, still about content moderation policy, still about Twitter. But Grace will tell us what's the situation in Nigeria with the social media platform. Grace, over to you.
Welcome to Updates from Africa, June 2021, coming to you from East Africa, where it's the cold season. But one of the most trending stories has to be what is now being called the Twitter ban in Nigeria. Twitter has barely been in Africa for a few months. They set up their Africa offices back in April. And, you know, some of the things they considered were issues like digital taxation and the content regulation policies in the different countries. But they've already waded into this controversy, which began, you know, on 5th June when they deleted a tweet from Nigeria's President Buhari, and in reaction, the federal government of Nigeria banned use of Twitter in the country. Of course, this has elicited a lot of reaction from civil society who are calling to an end to the ban. There has also been a suit filed at the regional court, the ECOWAS court, and the court has at least temporarily ordered the Nigerian government to stop prosecuting Twitter users. It's a story that we continue to observe as you know, different African countries come up with different content regulation mechanisms.
Thank you, Grace. I'm sure we'll hear about this more as the situation develops. We now move to the Middle East and North Africa, where Noha is waiting for us. Different platforms, same topic. Now we'll hear about Facebook being in hot water over removing content of Palestinians. Over to you, Noha.
This is Noha Fathi. I cover internet governance developments in the Middle East and North Africa region. The update in June is regarding Facebook content moderation policy. 18 organizations alongside more than 50 artists, journalists, and human rights advocates kicked off the hashtag Stop Silencing Palestinian campaign to advocate against Facebook's censorship of Palestinian voices. The latter was manifested when Facebook took down Palestinians' posts, an account that reported the forced evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and police brutality and clamped down on peaceful demonstrations. The campaign called upon Facebook to take some actions, including a full independent public audit of content moderation policies, complete transparency on requests, both legal and voluntary, transparency with respect to where automation and machine learning algorithms are being used to moderate content, transparency regarding any content guidelines or rules related to the classification and moderation of terrorism and extremism. And finally, commitment to a co-design process with civil society to improve policies involving Palestinian content. Pro-Palestinian activists have also embraced a campaign to give one-star reviews of Facebook in the App Store. This led around 200 Facebook employees to sign a petition calling for the platform to investigate content moderation regarding Palestinian posts. The petition notes that, as highlighted by employees, the press, members of the Congress, and as reflected in our declining App Store rating, our users and community at large feel that we are falling short on our promise to protect open expression around the situation in Palestine. Facebook employees have also required in the petition a third-party audit of the content moderation around Arabic and Muslim content. Thank you.
Thank you, Noha. This will be the end of the regional perspectives. We ended on a bit of a depressing note. We probably should have ended with 5G. It's not a good month for freedom of expression. What can I say?
Well, if nothing, then the good news is the summer is coming and we can hope that some things will change. Exactly. This also brings us to the end of today's briefing. And as I said, the good news is we will also take some summer break. I hope you will as well. So we won't have a briefing in July, but we will have on last Tuesday of the month in August, and that falls, if I'm not wrong, on 31st of August, same time, same place. Till then, stay safe, try to relax a little bit and get more energy for, I'm sure, a very hot digital autumn. Thank you and bye-bye.
Goodbye.